Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lucy Hall. I'm going to be the moderator for this evening. I'm a lecturer and researcher at the University of Amsterdam. And I wanted to open tonight by saying a few words. But before I get started, I wanted to thank Spouw 25, or Spouw 25 in my best Nederlands, for hosting us. And I wanted to thank the Amsterdam Law Hub and the Amsterdam Centre for European Studies, in particular the Emotions in Europe Politics Project, for their generous support in putting this event together. I also want to send some love and thanks to my colleagues Susan Leclerc, Natalie Dijkman and Lara Talsma, because without their work and their feminist commitment, this event wouldn't have been possible tonight. So thank you. And just a side note, this event is being broadcast and recorded. So a warm welcome to those of you who are joining us through the broadcast. So that's me done with the formalities. I wanted to start by saying I never set out to work on feminist foreign policy. Feminist foreign policy found me, and I'm quite happy that it did. I spent most of my career both in the UN and in academia asking questions about mass atrocity crimes and forced displacement from a queer feminist perspective. So I've taken these questions into the space of feminist foreign policy, as they are urgent questions. And I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that grave violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law are taking place right now in Gaza, in the Palestinian territories, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in the Central Sahel, in Myanmar, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ukraine. We also continue to see crimes against humanity being carried out in North Korea and against the weaker minority in the People's Republic of China. This is also, of course, not an exhaustive list. And if you're interested in reports on mass atrocity crimes, then I'd recommend checking out the Global Centre for Responsibility to Protect and their weekly updates on mass atrocity crimes. My inbox is a really depressing place right now. But on behalf of my colleagues here tonight, we wanted to state that as feminists and as representatives of civil society, we are profoundly concerned and compelled to address the appropriation of feminism and its language by certain states. These states, despite their promise to integrate feminist principles into their foreign policies, often engage in actions that contradict feminist foreign policy commitments and endanger the lives and well-being of millions of people worldwide. Their military interventions, the arms trade, their racist border control practices, and other colonial practices that cause immense suffering. As feminists, we know that this is not the first, and sadly probably not the last time, that states will profess an interest in women's rights and use the language of women's rights to justify military interventions. We saw it in Afghanistan, and we saw it in Iraq in the early 2000s. And the scenes of protest that we're seeing at this moment remind me of those protests in 2003 when we took to the streets to oppose the invasion of Iraq. And as feminists, we're also attuned to the ways in which violence and armed conflict exist across a continuum, and how invasion and occupation in one part of the world impacts the food security and safety of people in other parts of the world. We also know that the ways in which states have tested and used nuclear weapons in the last 40 or 50 years continue to have an intergenerational impact. We're also deeply aware that resolving and addressing violence through demilitarization is also intimately linked to addressing the health of our planet and our ecosystems. We live in a deeply and obscenely violent world. And this week, I have felt immense despair and at times hope. And it's because I've had the honour of being surrounded by feminist activists and civil society leaders who've spoken truth to power. They've literally called out the bullshit of our governments. They've called out our governments who are complicit in war crimes and genocide, and we called for a ceasefire. I've always needed a feminist community, and I'm very fortunate to have been able to build one with colleagues, with students, and with civil society leaders like Helen and Hannah and Lucy. But now more than ever, I need a feminist community to find solidarity, compassion, empathy, and strength. Can you just mute me while I blow my nose? Sorry. Out of care and respect, I was like, just mute me, blow my nose, get me back on. So I joined those who call for feminist foreign policies to focus on demilitarisation, to question arms trade deals that exceed billions of dollars, and as well to expose the violence of colonial, racist, cis, heteronormative capitalist order. We also denounce anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny, and the many ways in which these aspects violently intersect. So this event that we're here for tonight came together as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs held their conference on shaping feminist foreign policy, which was held this week in The Hague. And I think it's worth mentioning that the basis, the constitutional law basis for any of those in the room who are into constitutional law, is found in Article 1 of the Dutch Constitution, the principle of equality, as well as Article 90, the promotion of the international legal order. And what we wanted to do with this event tonight is create space for reflection and for dialogue, and to think about whether the voices and knowledge of women's civil society has been heard in the shaping of feminist foreign policy. So Hannah and I reached out to Helen and Lucy, and we're absolutely delighted that they accepted our invitation to be here with us tonight. So I'll take a seat, but I'd like to ask that, Sorry, this is also the masculine nature of these types of mics, where it's like, I'm wearing a dress, I don't have pockets, but it's fine. So we decided that we were going to ask the panel to introduce themselves. And I would like them to do so by also talking about how it is that they came to work in the feminist foreign policy space. Can I start with you, Lucy?
Good evening, everyone. My name's Lucy Wanjiku Mungala. So we were trying to balance the number of Lucys we would have on stage. So in my introduction, I think I used Wanjiku, that's my middle name, and which I also like to use sometimes because for me, it grounds me, and the meaning of the name also centers around agency in my tribe. So, and in Kenya, Wanjiku translates literally to citizens. So sometimes I like to use that. So I work with HIVOS Foundation. It's a Dutch NGO. Most of you in the room are young. You might not even have ever heard about HIVOS. I think only 5% of the Dutch people know HIVOS. But HIVOS is more than 55 years old. It's one of the 5 big Dutch NGOs. I work there as impact lead for our gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. So I work around gender issues and LGBTIQ rights mainly, and sexual and reproductive health. So I don't have a lot of peace and security knowledge, but I will try and blend in my experience as we talk about other issues. How did I get into the feminist foreign policy work? I think it was in late 2021. The ministry asked couple of us. I think we were around 15 people from civil society and feminist activists in the Netherlands when they were trying to explore about the possibilities of developing a feminist foreign policy. So I would say, luckily, I was there from the beginning in that exploration. And then they had a study that probably most of you have seen, which basically said, yeah, it would be a good idea for the Dutch government to follow the other progressive governments and have a feminist foreign policy. And the other part that I've been involved in is that there was also a call for civil society, especially people from the Global South, to be engaged in shaping the policy. But everything was done online, so which meant only people probably who had good connection, who are basically also based in the cities, would have access, and probably just people from NGOs. Let's just put it that way, participated in these meetings. And I'll talk a little bit further about that process and leading up to the conference. So that's how I got involved. So it's basically part of my daily work.
So foreign policy, feminist foreign policy found you?
Found me.
Yeah.
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 But I also remember challenging a lot of work that was happening with the other governments that had already put a label on their feminist, on their feminist foreign policy without integrating that with their other policies. So it's always like a standalone policy that is not integrated with, for instance, trade and development, with the military stuff. So it's always like a standalone thing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. And I'll talk about my experience in that consultation before I close. So my name is Helen Kezia Nwaha, and I work with the Women's International Peace Center based in Kampala in Uganda. We promote women's participation in peace building, and our work is basically in South Sudan, Burundi, DRC, and of course, Northern Uganda, where we all started off. How did I engage with feminist foreign policy? I think when Sweden started, we were almost like, okay, feminist foreign policy, what is that? And I started questioning and trying to learn, what is it about? Then I observed it's a lot about women, peace and security being connected to feminist foreign policy. Then I'm like, okay, so what does that mean? And how does it translate to peace, in the areas where we work? And I think I got so interested because I also observed the militarization of peace building. And the other thing that is never spoken about is the fact that a lot of the countries in the West that are labeling feminist foreign policies also produce arms and sell them to countries in conflict, and they go back and also give funds for humanitarian response. So I'm like, okay, this is contradictory. So what is feminism doing in foreign policy? Can they be a feminist foreign policy? So I was invited to this meeting, and we kept asking, how are you engaging with African feminists and African civil society? So when I was invited, I was very happy. But of course, I told them when I finished, I am Helen Kezia Nwaha, one African woman, privileged to have internet and connect to this meeting. I do not speak on behalf of African women. So please do not take my contribution to this conversation to mean that you have consulted African women. If you want to consult African women, go to Africa and meet them, because that's where they are. I had to do that because I felt like I didn't want them to think, oh, there was this civil society leader who was on the call, so we have consulted, And because I know the diversity amongst us as women, I couldn't really say I was speaking for everyone, because I was speaking from my own experience of work, which doesn't represent the entire Africa. So you're right. We also felt like having online consultation and calling it reaching out to civil society was really not very okay. And I got an impression that they were forced to do that by people like Lucy, who were pushing for more voices to the space. And then the other thing for me that got me thinking was ODA to women's rights organization has remained low forever. You know, we keep, the OECD does data collection. We've not seen any change. So I'm like, okay, what does feminist foreign policy mean? And for me who works in peace building, we know that women are always at the front line during conflict. We're seeing it with women in Sudan, you know, and the work they are doing. But this ODA will not get to them because they do not have the structure to be able to access those funding. So that also got me thinking. But lastly, is the fact that you're developing a feminist foreign policy, which is focused on your policy, you know, in other countries and the way you support them, but you're not engaging with feminists in those countries. So what is the relationship between your feminist foreign policy and feminists on the continent of Africa? So we started having conversation with, you know, Tony Hastrop, you know her, and I keep saying, you know, we can't keep quiet. We need to say something. You know, how do we even begin to bring African feminist voices into feminist foreign policy? While we understand that feminist foreign policy is for people who give aid, we also don't want African governments to be co-opted into this because they like to copy a lot. And we've seen South Africa saying, we want to develop a feminist foreign policy. And we're like, wait a little. And Libya already has a feminist foreign policy. And we're saying, okay, what does it mean? Particularly in the different contexts we are in. So having that conversation to first of all say the context is different. It's not one size fits all. And please, can you understand the lived realities here before you come? But how do we monitor the implementation? So I still have that question. It hasn't been answered, but we keep, you know, we are still engaging in this process. But what we think we want to do is to define what would it mean for us from Africa, because we do have frameworks like the Maputo Protocol, you know, very progressive frameworks that we think, hey, wait, if you want to do feminist foreign policy, can you acknowledge some of the existing work that African feminists have done and see how it can also lead you into what, yeah, let me stop there. Thank you.
Keep going. I don't mind. Hannah?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'm really happy we are here now together and we can process also the past days at the conference, and yeah, we can hear also your thoughts and maybe also some people in the audience. So my name is Hannah Mühlenhoff. I'm an assistant professor at the European Studies Department at the University of Amsterdam, and my interest kind of comes from an interest in the European Union and member states' security policies. And when I say security, I usually mean the security of women, of queer people, and of marginalized people. However, if I say to colleagues I study EU security and maybe even defense policy, that's not usually what they are thinking about. And I also, of course, in this context, study the women, peace and security agenda, but I'm generally interested more broadly in questions of security and militarism, because I find it also very important to, you know, get out of the silo that also I think the women, peace and security agenda was, but really look at, okay, what does it mean when, for instance, in my case, the EU is, but also in the case of the member states, is militarizing or is doing this and that? What does it mean for the women, peace and security agenda? What does it mean in terms of gender, etc.? Yeah, how did I come to the FFP space? I think also it came to me, but I was actually wondering about this. How did I come to feminist actually work more broadly, because this is not really what I started doing in my studies or in my PhD. I studied political science and the EU, and this is not where you encountered any feminist work, at least not in the past, and I think still not enough, definitely now. But I was very interested in how the European Union supports civil society and activists in its work, because that's kind of what it claims to do, and I studied Turkey. So I really wondered how kind of the EU's very kind of neoliberal approach to civil society and to human rights, how this meets in, with civil society actors in a specific context. And I talked to women's and queer organizations in Turkey, and I think they actually brought me to doing feminist work. So I was thinking about this today. So in that sense, I actually think through talking to civil society during my PhD, I started actually also being more interested in the feminist and queer literature. So in that sense, I think this is kind of a nice circle. And then I also started wondering, okay, what is actually the EU doing on the women, peace and security agenda? Wasn't very much at that point, but there was also not much questioning of that. And also the Netherlands, and there I'm also still very much interested in the question of how does the state or the EU relate to civil society, and what does this funding do, and is it really reaching the needs of civil society? And somehow, of course, now from the WPS, I think it builds on WPS, the feminist foreign policy, but I was actually really reluctant to engage with the feminist foreign policy because I really also felt this. I mean, you've already said kind of the key things, right? I mean, how can a state actually do a feminist foreign policy? Also, feminist and foreign policy somehow is already a contradiction as such, since we want to overcome the binaries between the domestic and the foreign. Also, in times of increasing militarization, racist border regimes, I really don't understand how this works together. However, I was interviewed for a study on FFP for the EU. So I think as someone working on WPS, we started also, of course, thinking about this. And I was actually also at one of these consultations. And now that you talked about it, I also wanted to share my impression. So I was at a consultation that in principle took place on site. And it was also with the context of EU cooperation, I think was a broader topic. And there were organizations there from the Netherlands and some scholars, I think we were two. And I was actually online because I wasn't here at the moment, but the other people were on site, so there was definitely a difference there. And my impression was just that it was extremely superficial. I don't know how it was in your case. It was super fast. It was kind of all these mind maps. And I had the feeling like we were there to provide arguments for why this is such a great idea. So to put it a bit cynically, I found it very, alienating, I have to say, just to add that. Mm.
But I think in the spirit of reflection, and I think when we sat down for dinner earlier tonight, we all kind of agreed that we needed a moment to just be like, what happened this week? I found out that during the recording of the closing speech of the Minister of Foreign Affairs that I was actually filmed screaming at her. I stand by it. But I just wanted to sort of ask, so I'm still reflecting on that. I was like, ooh, probably not going to get invited back, but that's okay. But I wanted to sort of ask for some reflections this week. And Lucy, I know that you were involved with the side events, with the community events that sort of started on Tuesday, I believe, which also sounded way more fun. So I was wondering if you could tell us, like, what was sort of the momentum and the motivation for these community events, and what was sort of the main sort of outcomes?
So I'm gonna mention two things about the feminist foreign policy. One, I think the Dutch government has been a key player on funding women's rights, LGBTQ rights. So in terms of resources, it's always never enough, but they have done some good work. They've been at the forefront of doing that. For me, what is really, and they could have continued doing that without labeling it feminist. But I'm actually happy that they labeled it feminist, because now we expect them to be disruptive, to be radical, and to be more accountable. So at the end, I think as much as a lot of things are still not feminist, the feminist principles, I wouldn't say they are watershed, and they still have a long way to go, but they've given us more to sort of hold them accountable. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. They would have just continued doing what they do without labeling it. And the other thing is, if they label it feminist, they have to earn that label. So, and that's what we are going to really, and I think it's for all of us to hold them accountable to that. So, leading up to those consultations, so I'm based in the Netherlands, but I'm from Kenya. And in most spaces, I feel the consultations didn't go very well, and we anticipated that it would be that way. So as feminist civil society organizations in the Netherlands, because there was very little space for people who would go, and we wanted a lot of people to participate in a more easy, casual way, we decided to organize a full day of events outside of the conference. And so we called it the Community Festival. And we had almost the same parallel sessions that were happening at the conference. Actually, I never attended the conference, and I don't think I missed anything. So I think that also that the civil society showed that they can organize something like a parallel sessions. That was key. And the participation was very much open. And there were a few government officials there, but not from anyone from the ministry, and not anyone from the Dutch ministry. I think I saw a couple of governments from Mexico, Luxembourg, and others who have the FPP, but yeah. But I think what I want to say about what came out of those, the community festival, was that the civil society, people who were around, who financed themselves to come here, not even waived on visas. I mean, there are people who are already talking about we should be arguing about feminist visas. Like, it's so complicated for a lot of activists to travel and get visas to participate in these processes. So the idea was that each and every of those sessions, there would be some outcomes that they would then present to during the conference, because they never actually had a chance to sit and talk together. So this was a moment where a lot of activists actually met and talked to each other. People working on peace and security, people working on queer stuff. I learned a lot about sex work, which I didn't know a lot, so that was also nice. But there was also no people from the academy. So that's something that we also need to sort of really start working around. How then do we also collaborate, even in those counter spaces when we are trying to be radical and work outside of the formal structures? Because I think that's what feminists are supposed to do, disrupt a little bit. So I think those sessions were really useful.
So thank you. I was in one of those sessions at the Community Festival, and our session was for a research we are conducting with Code Aid and the broker, where we are looking at the practicality of implementing feminist foreign policy in fragile contexts, fragile and autocratic contexts. So we are using South Sudan and Afghanistan as our case studies. So what we did was to look at the theory of change for the feminist foreign policy, and then look at the ODA to those two countries and try to see where feminism could be applied. And the question we are asking ourselves was, are there other policies, social contracts that could actually be used to achieve feminist foreign policy? We were lucky we had two people from the ministry in our own meeting who work on WPS. So we really had conversation with them and, really to find out. So this is the ODA to Afghanistan. And this is what's happening in Afghanistan. Where are the opportunities for us, despite what we know about women's rights in Afghanistan, to engage? What are the things that are already happening that we can use as opportunity to reach out to the women to make sure that, and then we had somebody from Afghanistan who was sharing with us what is being done, what the women are doing. And the question we're asking people from the ministry is, if this is your plan for Afghanistan, is it possible for you to change the direction to what the people on ground need right now, So for me, it was very interesting. But I was also at the other one, And I think because of my background, I was also very much interested in issues around militarization. I was in this session on militarization and masculinities. And I thought it was very interesting to listen to somebody from Sudan talk about the conflict and how masculinities, and militarization is playing, that role in facilitating the conflict, and how it has impacted on women. But it was also encouraging to hear from people who work on positive masculinity saying, and I go away with that, and I talked to him, I said, when I hear men engage, I stop. Because I'm like, what are they engaging now? So he said to us that what they are promoting is taking feminism and women's rights and everything to men where they are, and not taking positive masculinity to women, because it's not them who need it. It's the men, but going to their own spaces. And I told him, thank you so much, because I am really not wanting you to bring it to us, because we are not the problem, and we don't want you to bring the men to us, because that would also be problematic. But take it to their spaces and they remain there, So I thought that was very interesting. And then the other thing I thought generally was the fact that feminist foreign policies fail to understand the transformative nature of feminism. The fact that, when you're doing feminism, intersectionality is important. I think they talk about it without really understanding the extent of it, because I look at intersectionality around me at the conference and I'm saying, okay, how is it being applied? So my fear is the fact that the application of feminism within the practice of feminist foreign policy might never really happen. But just like Lucy is saying, they were doing very well already, with funding. I think the Netherlands is one of those countries that have really given money for, women's rights work, and for many years, and, large amounts compared to other countries, and they are still giving. So did they have to label it that or not? So so the last one is that I think there's the danger that if we don't use feminism properly within foreign policies, it can become harmful and regressive to the feminist agenda. So we really need to be, a bit careful the way we use it and the way we apply it, so that we don't perpetuate, continue to perpetuate neoliberal colonialism. And the other thing I ask myself is, to what extent do we make sure that we are not repeating historical racism, colonization, and discrimination? And how do we make sure that feminist foreign policy does not replicate inequalities that we already see and discrimination in the approaches? I fear, from what I saw, that even those who are implementing it are not aware of what it really means. So maybe a lot of education, and again, back to the academia being engaged. So we can talk more about that.
Yeah. So I was at the conference, but I think I attended the queer session that was at the community festival that then took place at the conference. And I also was in this event on militarization masculinities. And I think these were sessions that were organized by civil society, and they were, I think, very, very interesting. But reflecting on the conference more broadly, I think one thing that I wanted to mention is that what it really also reminded me of is the violence that so many people in this space are experiencing, but also the courage that so many in this space have. And I think the question, this despair and hope that Lucy was talking about, I think very much was defining for the conference. There was actually lots of tears at this conference. And yeah, it was also difficult sometimes, but it reminded me that we need to care, and we need to listen. And working in the university, which is often quite individualizing, and there's a lot of competition and so forth, even working on security and violence, I think we sometimes need to be reminded why we're doing this work. And then what really stood out to me more broadly is that there was such a strong disconnect between the discourse of the policymakers, so to say, the government, the ministries, or also the international kind of donor organization representatives that were there, and the civil society representatives on the other side. Whereas I kind of felt that the ministry and the officials were very much talking about rights and maybe representation to some extent. It was very much about funding civil society, I think, within the given structures. And you just talked about this aspect that, the transformative aspect of feminism is very much kind of watered down, to say the least. And I think we heard actually there are a lot of civil society calling for much more, and they called for demilitarization, they called for decolonization, that called for different migration policies, and they also called for the dismantling of the political economy that's based on extraction and militarism. And they called for the end of the liberal peace agenda and expressed demands for justice. And I think the difference between these two discourses was really immense, and I did not feel like there was much listening. And I have a bit of like a worry with the ministry focusing so much on they're saying we need to listen to civil society, and they did these consultations, this time also with organizations from the Global South. But I think they're mainly talking about funding civil society, and they're not actually listening to their knowledge. And I think that to me became quite apparent. And maybe also a little bit connected. I think when we discuss this a lot, there seems to be quite a lack of leadership in feminist foreign policy in the Netherlands, and I'm German. I also follow a little bit the feminist foreign policy in Germany, which is very much embraced by the foreign minister in Germany. I'm not saying it's any better, but here it's very different. And I mean, here also the feminist foreign policy came through the Senate, actually, a question in the Senate, and then I think very much through the existing civil society networks, Women Equals Men, and the kind of WPS, the Women, Peace and Security actors that were already there. But we could really see with at this conference in the past 2 days that the representatives from the ministry were, really talking very different language, I think. And I don't know what this means in the sense of that we could say, well, maybe it's good that it's not so much embraced by the leadership because we don't know what the leadership will look like in couple of months. But at the same time, I think there's also a question of commitment. And I mean, also strikes me it's basically not reported in the media at all. That there's a feminist foreign policy and that there was a conference. So I think this raises some questions in terms of like ownership and leadership.
Of course, yeah.
I think for me, you've all mentioned some keywords like decolonization, militarization. If you search those words in the current form of FPP outline, you will not find them. And if you find them, it's a one sentence saying LGBTQ inclusion. So in essence, it turns out to be, and there are different forms of feminism. We all understand that. So just the language and the context will be very different for different people. So we can already take that out. But if feminist foreign policy is supposed to listen, they're supposed to listen and ensure that their implementation and resources are grounded on local realities, but also informed by the ideas of what people want, then those keywords should be part of their policies. And those keywords, without even action, for now, would mean something, would be something to hold on to, but they are not there. And I kind of feel like in all the feminist foreign policies that I've seen, they are very much led by nationalistic priorities, and it's mainly around security and trade. So let's just call it the way it is. It's those two things that are key priorities in these feminist foreign policies. Mm. And maybe the question now is, how do we work around those ideas to ensure well-being, to ensure care? If we are not talking about the root causes also of issues to do with conflict and inequalities, you can pour as so much money to the problem, but you're just covering it up. And I think if we truly want to embrace feminist foreign policies, those are the things that we need to start interrogating.
I'm glad you mentioned the word care, because that was also a theme that we wanted to use as a bit of an anchor point for our reflections tonight. And there has been a lot of questions asked about the care work done in Women, Peace and Security, which is obviously the feminist forerunner to FFP. And we've had colleagues talk about the ways in which the efforts of civil society have been tremendous in the WP, the Women, Peace and Security space, to the extent that we would argue that Women, Peace and Security would not exist, it would not be a sustained agenda at the UN Security Council if it was not for the work and the care labour done in civil society spaces. And when I think about this work on Women, Peace and Security and care labour, I think it would be very easy to replace Women, Peace and Security with feminist foreign policy.
The Women, Peace and Security agenda is being co-opted into meaning feminist foreign policy.
Yeah. So the question that I would like to reflect on is, what does care work mean to you in the work that you do and in your life? And if you want to share in your relationships?
That's so interesting. So, we have traditionally been socialized to care. I have a personal story. I'm the first daughter in my family, and we are 6. While we were very young, anytime my mother is going out, she said, "Oh, take care of your siblings." And you're just like their mother. No, I can't be. You're our mother. Don't give me your responsibility. Because I felt like, how could I be their mother? But I found out that as I'm getting older, I have a younger sister who calls me mom. So one day I called her and said, why do you call me mom? I'm not your mother. I'm your sister. She said, but mom say you are our mother. So you're socialized and brought up to care. So sometimes I feel the burden to care, to find out how everyone is doing, to support when it is needed. But I think it's the same thing that happens to women when there's conflict. I interview a lot of women, refugees who say, I was running and I saw this child running alone. Probably the mother had died and I pick her up or him up, but I don't know who it is. And we are here in the camp and this child becomes mine. And I give him a name, probably they don't even have a name. So that burden of care is what we have in our personal lives, is what we find women doing in peace work. The dangers of it is you are overburdened all the time. And a lot of the work, for example, that woman who picked that child doesn't get paid for it. Nobody counts it. She gets to the camp, she registers, she gives them the story. They say, okay, madam, keep her, take the card, and you get food. And, she can't let go because of that motherly instinct, and I mean, for you in the academia, you know all the stories about, mothering and caring. But the other thing is, we as women human rights defenders work in contexts that are also very, very complex. So we work in settings where, the space is shrinking. So we have laws that are being put in place and regulations. The place where I live and work, you can't demonstrate. You saw how I was so excited to demonstrate and shout on top of my voice, for Palestine. Because I can't remember the last time I did that. You will get killed. It's bullets. I mean, it's live bullets. There's no... some years back, we could wear white and do peace march. These days, we can't. They just bundle you into the pickup, rape you on the way. The dangers are real. But just to say that, even then, I think a lot of the embassies, and one of them, Netherlands Embassy, is one of those safe spaces for human rights defenders. I mean, they say to us, if you want to have a meeting, please, come to our embassy. I remember during the elections in 2021 where they say, if you want to come and work here, because they have internet, the internet will go off, you can communicate. So those are the complex settings where we are working. We are working knowing that we are being traced most of the time. We are being followed and tracked, but you just hope you don't get arrested. You need to be on the network. So people say, okay, your name is not on the list yet, but just pack your suitcase in case, you get deported, So that is the context where we work. And you can't say, because it's so dangerous, I go. You leave it for who? But every day that there might be danger, people who got arrested, they didn't think they were going to be arrested. But the trauma that they go through is something you don't want to go through. So you also work in a context where you see people who have suffered from war, women who have been affected by conflict, and you listen to their stories. So I was just sharing with someone, I don't know if you see that, you document those stories because you want to use them for advocacy, but you get secondary trauma because the stories don't leave you. And it becomes more difficult if you cannot do anything. Because the women say to you, what do you want from me? Because a lot of people have also gone to them, taking their stories, and they never go back. So sometimes we do understand that these things need to be researched, but you need to show care, and empathy by at least saying, have some food. So we also ask ourselves, how do we feminize this process? You go to a woman who is in the refugee camp, you know she doesn't have sanitary towel, go with something. It might not be a lot, but show empathy. So the problem with it is, what I also wanted to say that is problematic about supporting peace-building work is, or something that feedback that has to go for this Netherlands policy, is that they're also funding in silos. Mm. So economic empowerment, peace building, sexual and reproductive, but these things are connected. So when we are talking about intersectionality, we are saying that you cannot have peace if your body has not healed, if you don't have access to reproductive health services, if you do not get justice for rape, for the harms that have been done to you, it's not possible. You can't be peaceful. I remember we started asking, what does peace mean to you? And one woman said to me, food on my table. So don't tell me to go and sit at the table. What am I going to say at the peace table if my children have not eaten? Mm. But you don't have funding to give food. It's not allowed. You see what I mean? So how do we also enable feminist foreign policy to see that we need some level of flexibility and interconnection to be able to address the multiple layers of challenges that people face? And when we are talking about achieving gender equality, because for me that's the main focus of feminist foreign policy, that is so many layers at the same time, and you can't do one without the other. Mm. If not, we just keep going around the circles. Yeah. So it's been that. But the other thing, and I will stop, is also the fact that we do this work and we're expected to do it and not get paid. Somebody was sharing her experience about how they wanted, it was in the conference, how some organization wanted her to do some consultancy, and she gave them the rate, and they said, oh, but you're in this country. And she's like, yeah, that's my rate. That women are also undervalued and underpaid for their work just because they are women. Mm. And sometimes we do that because we want the work done. But again, what does it really mean? That you have to insist that even if I am a black woman and I live in Africa, I have more than 20 years of experience. So don't tell me your rate is 200. Because if I was not black, probably, with more than 20 years, you pay me maybe 1,000, or I don't know what the rate is, honestly. So we do it because we want the work done, but we think it has connection with this thing that we do free care work. Yeah. So even when you do intellectual work, it's valued from that caring, yeah, not paying for care work again. So, the connections, yeah.
So, for me, I look at care as value, care as love, and care as in also being able to center yourself, so get paid for whatever you're worth. But I also see care as a moral responsibility. And I'm going back to what happened yesterday at the closing session. And I don't know how many people managed to watch the closing session of that. So during the week, during the 2 days, there was a lot of calls about ceasefire. And we all know it's a feminist thing actually to do, that you have to think about security, well-being. It's about gender-based violence. But the more you keep providing military money, selling weapons, the chances of there being peace that does not involve violence are also very slim. And what, for me, the closing session was such a deft tone. Even the moral responsibility as a form of care for people who were there crying. And I know the Dutch government has a stand on what side they are on, But if you want to listen and people were shouting something different, ceasefire, and you just say it on their face, like, this is where we are at, it's like, take it or not. I think that is not a form of care that is feminist and that has a moral responsibility, nor does it have the care for people in the room. And you can have a stand, but I also don't think that was the right moment for the statements that were made to be made. So I think for me those are key values. I also think well-being is important, and I know for some of us as activists, we put ourselves on the line a lot, depending on at what level of activism you are at. Some of us are behind the desk or doing it online, but still there are so many different forms of violence that people experience, and I think we just need to be aware also not to put ourselves in risk. And for me, what I've learned when I was at the forefront of activism is to learn to ask for help. And I know for a long time, because I worked with the queer people in Uganda, and I'm Kenyan, and I was in the list. Every time I would walk at the airport, I would always be flagged out. And nothing happened, but I felt always intimidated. But also the organization that I work for, you would imagine then we would have a very proper safety and security policy for people like myself. I didn't have that. And things are improving. That was 10 years ago. Things are improving, but it's always based on which countries are coded red, green, blue, or orange. And I can tell you, those color codings don't come from countries like mine. We always have to use color coding based on other countries' perceptions of what level of security threat there is. And so if that was not a security threat, for some of my colleagues who are coming from The Hague, then it was not considered a risk. So I go back to those words that people are talking about decolonization, people are talking about reparations, but if people who are actually saying they want to have a feminist foreign policy don't listen to those conversations, and they're hard conversations to have, we all agree, but we have to show the intention to do something, and they have to earn still that label.
And show the intention to listen.
Yeah, the intention to listen.
Yeah. And not give your closing speech and then leave, which is what happened at the conference from the Minister of Foreign Affairs. They were pretty quickly rushed out the door, it seemed.
Everybody was crying.
Yeah. Hannah? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you for also, I think, bringing that here. I think that's really important. I want to keep it short also because we're already moving towards the end. But I just also wanted to kind of underline that feminist peace research has talked a lot about centering an ethics of care in a feminist, in peace and security as well. And I think that's often also very missing from the language of feminist foreign policy. And and care can, of course, and you also already mentioned kind of the downsides of it, care can also, of course, be kind of patriarchal or also kind of neo-colonial. And I think we also have to be then again also concerned or look out for that if it's used in this kind of problematic kind of language. But it should mean to listen, and as we've now said and heard several times, that's not really happening. But I wanted to speak a little bit about also what care means when you're doing research on violence and security, and I think also listening to what you're talking about. Of course, the research only exists because of the knowledge of civil society and activists, and because of the people who share the knowledge with us, the researchers. And so I think for us as researchers, there's a strong, we need to be, have an ethics of care in our own work, and we need to kind of listen to the knowledge and to the need of civil society. I mean, this was also our idea for this event, in a sense, that there needs to be. We need to talk, and we need to, we need to know what we can do as researchers to kind of advance the actual feminist goals. And in a sense, I think also we have the responsibility to use the time and resources that we have as researchers, and also sometimes maybe the safety. Even though I think we also sometimes need to look out for ourselves, because also, also even the context here, things are changing, and we are not always safe either, even if it might be different. But we need to use our time and resources to amplify the voices and kind of create a bigger pictures and point to the structures and challenge the institutions. So I hope that we can, that we can focus on that together. And I think an ethics of care is very important here as well.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's really hard for me to see that clock at the back, but I think we've got about 10 minutes left. So what I thought I would do is take a round of questions, and while we do that, ask my final question to the panel here to give you some time to think about it. And it's quite a selfish question, because as someone in research, someone with the resources and the capacities that I have, that Hannah has, we'd really like to know, how do you envision the relationship between civil society and academia? Also knowing that you both sit between academia and civil society with one foot in both areas. So how do we want to do questions? Do you want to run the mic around? That would be amazing. I can't see, so I'm just going to trust you to do that.
Do we say our names or just?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Serena Cruz. I'm a global surgery expert and also have lots of experience as a medical ethnographer, and I've worked in gender and conflict for some time. So the question that I have for all of you, because I think you each, your positionality can bring resources in different ways. But the question that I thought you all were going to go in this direction, but you didn't. So now I'm like, okay, I got to ask this question. Where is there space to do feminist activism around research ethics and whether that research is applied, which it sounds like you do programmatically for your NGOs, and where is it just purely scholarship? So that's my question is, where is there space? Thanks.
Can we take another question down here? Sorry, yeah.
Hi, my name is Shirin. I am from a women's rights NGO here in the Netherlands. I was invited for this conference, but I sent the director an email that, do you really think that I have time to come and clap for you? And why? Because there were many motions passed in our parliaments to include also the issues of Muslim women in the feminist foreign policy, and to be very specific, marital captivity. And that means that Dutch divorce verdicts are not recognized. It means that you have to marry twice here, or that you have to go back to the country of origin to divorce. It's the forced continuation of a marriage. So what I also miss in this conversation, I hear about peace and conflict and intersectionality, and but I don't hear anything about the issues of Muslim women and also Catholic women, Jewish women who don't have access to divorce. and that means that there is no gender equality in all those countries, and it has direct impact on women here, on the migrant communities, because they you know, I mean, as when it comes to Muslim women, as long as Sharia is not applied, you cannot divorce. And in the past, women living under Muslim laws was getting funding from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's good that there is attention for peace, women in peace and conflict, LGBTI rights, but I don't hear anything about the issues of Muslim women, Jewish women within the family law, and even Christian women. In many countries, they even cannot divorce, and that is very important. So there are many blind spots. And specifically on marital captivity, when motions are passed in our parliaments to include it in the FFP, when it is not implied, you know, implemented, then I think something is very wrong. Maybe within our bestuurscultuur. Well, that was it.
Hi, thank you so much for this event. My name is Maya Turolla and I work as a, postdoctoral researcher at the Radboud University in Nijmegen. My research is about the European foreign policy making for what concerns conflict countries in the Sahel. And I am particularly interested in what it means to do policy making, and particularly the coherence of all these different silos. And somehow feminist foreign policy came to me when I realized that so little of my respondents in Brussels were women. And in fact, that the majority of policymakers, particularly at the higher level of manager position, are men. We are talking about 30% women at the top, so to speak. So my question is, what does it mean to do policy making in a feminist way, from really the policy making, the doing of it, the making of the policies, and who does the policies? So not only feminist foreign policy in terms of women as an object, but women as the agents of these policies.
Can we take two more questions, like one here and then one down the front? And then I think I'll go to the panel for a response.
Thank you. My name is Zia Wei. I work for a medical humanitarian NGO. I didn't study foreign policy, so please direct my question towards the context. I was wondering, so some of the contexts we have encountered are also related to what is mentioned, the liberal colonization, or the idea that, for example, Afghanistan, so the dilemma would be whether we're staying there to have men treating men, or whether we're just leaving. And another one might be we want to give the power back to people. We want to empower the countries. We want to embrace the local leadership. But then we face the diversity issue more and more. So my question is, as from foreign policy towards feminism, how could Netherlands or possibly any country position itself mindfully to know the limits, know what it entails for each of the policy that were made to still approach the feminism and embrace it in the global context? If you have any experience with that, thank you.
And I've got one more question down the front here from Lucia here. And then I'll go to the panel.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Dr. Lucia Kula. I'm a lecturer in law and gender in London at SOAS, and I do quite a lot of work on looking at the intersections of feminist work in law. I'm a human rights lawyer by profession. And I heard a lot of interesting comments around the Dutch government's role in feminist policy, or at least their objectives in feminist policy. And I'm curious to hear if you think it's a conditional approach to feminist policy, feminist foreign policy making, because I'm hearing a lot of implications on how they want the feminist foreign policy to work, right? I'm looking at particularly the comments of they've given a lot of money to NGOs, and they've funded a lot of human rights work in different parts of the world, but has it been a conditional contribution to that work? And also going back to the comments you made, Helen, around how often that money also dictates what kind of feminist work is happening, right? What kind of conversations we're actually having in feminist foreign policy. The implications we see then, for example, in what kind of projects are done when it comes to gender-based and sexual violence. The example that you raised, I've seen similar in my work, where you see because money goes towards gender-based violence and sexual violence, then all of a sudden all the women are raped, right? That's the conversation that then takes place. So I'm wondering if the influence and the implication of the Dutch government being involved in foreign policy, feminist foreign policy, then also means that it's a conditional type of work that's happening.
Thanks. So what I might do is ask the panel to, maybe starting with Lucy, to address the series of comments and questions that we just had.
Yeah. I think...
Yes.
Maybe I start with the last one, because I remember it the most. There was a lot of questions. I think every aid comes with its own conditionalities. So that's for sure. One of the things for me that I've seen, especially when foreign policies have the label feminist, I'm seeing a lot of it being co-opted to mean women, peace and security, and women and girls. Mm. And the rest is just additional stuff. So far, that's my interpretation. Secondly, I also think it's a performative thing. Someone from Mexico in one of the community festivals actually said they have a feminist, they are one of the Global South countries with a feminist foreign policy, but they don't have funds to implement it. So why? Why have it? I know they do have some like an ambassador role to go for that, but then that's also performative, because if this person doesn't have the resources to implement the policy, then why have it? So that's what I would say around this area. And then in terms of space for research, I think there's a lot, but I think the problem always comes to the power hierarchies between people in academia and NGO world, and how they negotiate those hierarchies. And the other side of it is that NGOs do not prioritize, or they are very underfunded to do research. So if there's gonna be a balance, it's academias and NGOs to create it. I think you have to claim the space, because you will always have a research question that needs to be answered. But the question is, what I always find on both sides is that when we come in as researchers, it's not always that we are thinking about how is my research work and my findings going to be helpful on the everyday life of your research subjects. And that for NGO translates to, how can I use these findings to fundraise, and to do lobby and advocacy. And then when you think about the long procedures of writing research proposals, that is time that NGOs don't have. We are not funded for that. And so if you really want to work and create space, I think we have to start questioning about what kind of genuine relationships and partnerships are we creating. And I think if that doesn't happen, we will always look at you as people who come and do our midterm reviews, our end-term evaluations, and then move on. But I think also the way the academia positions itself, I think that needs to change, because you always come into NGOs, and that includes me, as capacity building people. You're not. And I think once we start changing that narrative, like you're not coming to do capacity building to NGOs in terms of how we collect data, how we monitor it, whose knowledge is being prioritized is a key question, and how that knowledge actually translates to real lives. How do we communicate that knowledge? I've seen so many good reports, but unless you're really keen, they're not useful for NGOs, because we want bullet points to take to members of parliament. So how do we synthesize those big, good research reports into workable talk? I'm just going to say talk points at this point, because sometimes that's just what we need. I'm going to stop there, I think. But I don't remember her name, but I also feel the issue around intersectionality is key, and being able to talk around a lot of issues. And I think gender-based violence is something that manifests in different ways. And I think just being able to look at the different ways in which gender-based violence happens is critical. So not only from a conflict setting, but also how does that translate to other issues. So I feel her. Yeah.
So thank you. You've taken almost all the questions. Thank you. But I was just going to say to you that one of the issues we've also been raising about feminist foreign policies is the local context. And in the language, they call it policy coherence. And we're asking, is all right to give aid to people in Africa who need reproductive health and rights, but how about the women in your countries? I mean, and that voice, those voices were missing in the conference. You know, I didn't see any session that talked about religion, rights, migrants. It wasn't there. So it also says something about what you said earlier, the focus on women, peace, and security. And for us who are in women, peace, and security, we're also saying no. Yeah. We are still applying militarized peace building. The response we are seeing, and at the end of the day, might really not lead to the kind of peace that women, peace, and security is talking about. So we need to continue to call for attention to those issues that still need to be attended to, at the country level. And also to ensure that feminist foreign policy applies to all the sectors and to everyone, both at home and abroad. So you can't go abroad to do FFP when there's no FFP at home. It doesn't make any sense,
Yep.
Then the other for me is the issue of Sahel. And I think the research we're doing in terms of how do you apply FFP in fragile and autocratic context. And the question would also be if you're looking for research areas, is in those contexts in the Sahel. How does FFP, how is it working? And people are predicting that we're going to have more problems in the Sahel. You see how it is spreading, and how are women viewing it? How are we conscious of the needs and realities of the local people? I remember people calling me, during the Niger thing and saying, oh, you need to issue a statement. I said, no, let's talk to the women first. Don't issue statement on their behalf. You don't know what they want. Don't just assume that because this has happened, we need to start shouting. And women say, we are okay, we support them. And I said, I told you. So it is understanding the context first before you take your FFP. What do the local people want and how do they want it? It's something that, we need to pay attention. What we started with, listen. And I think a lot of times they are not listening. If they listened, then they'll be able to apply it. And there's also the assumption that women live in those contexts and they are not happy. So we want to go and help them. Poor, impoverished, women, sometimes they have agency as well. They're taking action by themselves. So what they need is for you to support them with the actions they want, which is making a difference in their lives, not what you think they need. So in the case of Sahel, yes, we see it, and I think the applicability will be listen to the lived realities of women and apply your feminist foreign policy to their own context so that it will make meaning. I'll leave you to address the other ones.
There's not many left, so that's very good for me. But I wanted to maybe address the question on the institutions that was also asked by the colleague from Nijmegen. And I was just thinking when you were talking about how FFP often means WPS, so one abbreviation to the other. This is exactly also my feeling, and I was thinking, in a sense, it elevated maybe the women, peace and security agenda to like a bigger public, even though I would even question that in the Dutch context. And I would also argue normally WPS should have a much broader understanding of security than it does, but it's still, we really saw it sticks very much to this the security, kind of traditional security field. And I think this is also visible in the institutions that are working on this, because it's very much with the people in the foreign ministries and the European External Action Service that have worked on women, peace and security. And I don't think there's any, the question is very interesting, because I think currently I don't think there's any feminist policy making taking place, because it's often very understaffed groups. It's like, I don't know what it's now, but I think it's like 4 people or so. Yeah, in the foreign ministry, and I think also in the European External Action Service, that are trying to mainstream feminist foreign policy or gender into all policies. And as you can probably imagine, they are also very, sidelined in their own context, right? So the institution as such are still extremely masculine and very patriarchal and hierarchical. So I think that's also a big issue. I'm sure you're aware of probably the literature on feminist institutionalism that is also kind of doing this kind of looking into these kind of questions. And yes, I think the academics are not very good with bullet points, and I think we need to work on that.
That reminds me.
No, I think one last thing. And, there's also a lot of talk about shifting power. And what that would mean for academias and NGOs to work together is to co-produce more together.
Yes.
And I think by doing that, then this narrative of capacity building shifts. And if you keep co-producing together, then you get into a rhythm of understanding each other's needs, because you also have your needs that you want to achieve with the form of data that you're collecting. And I think, that would be a good starting point.
Let's do it. we're really over time, and I realise it's Friday night, and there's probably a lot of you out there who are like, I need a drink. I know I'm one of them. It's been a big week. But I wanted to thank you all so much for being here. I think this was such a valuable space to take a breath and reflect and set our own priorities. And I don't know if anyone's planning to go to the Mexico FFP conference next year, but like, maybe we should, and maybe we should be doing community side events as a priority, and ignoring the other stuff. But just to sort of, my final note is thinking about how FFP has grown out of this women, peace and security space. And we're not done with women, peace and security, because we still see that that has also been co-opted and militarised. And I'd like to end by probably butchering a quote from my PhD supervisor, but she wrote that women, peace and security shouldn't be about making war safe for women. It should be about ending all wars. Ceasefire now, everywhere.